Hello everyone, welcome to SSW TV. My name's Luke and I'm here with Dennis.
Thank you. It's an honor.
For sure. So I know that you're the author of the Fluent Assertions Library. Can you tell me a little bit about how that came about?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I've been a big proponent of things like unit testing and test-driven development, and I think I started practicing test-driven development maybe 15 years ago, and that's roughly when Fluent Assertion also started, because I learned kind of the hard way that if you want to do unit testing and TDD correctly, it is all about making sure that your tests are self-describing, intention revealing, stuff like that, so that you actually look at the test and almost can read them as documentation, which I honestly believe this is true. This is the promise, but you can actually reach that point. And I was simply looking for a way to make my assertions more natural, more, some people would say fluent, but some people think fluent APIs are not really the best way of doing it. I still like them. And it started as a small internal project with a colleague of mine, and that evolved somehow. You know, I started putting on Codeplex at that time. Then at some point NuGet was introduced, thanks to Phil Heck. And that evolved over the years, became bigger and bigger and bigger. And I still use it myself every day because it helps with the documentation part, to make it, to clarify what kind of outcome the test will give you.
Do you find yourself using tools to generate kind of documentation sites based on those tests, or you find it just for developers where they can open them?
No, it's purely for developers. So, you know, if I practice TDD in a way where I try to, like the books will tell you, you have to write a test first before you write anything. I think that's, I don't know if I can say that, but bull, whatever. And no, what I like to do is I first try to think of the design, you know, come up with maybe sketch physically on paper, maybe on a board, whiteboard with some colleagues. And then I'm starting to sketch out the API and everything. It's only after that cycle, after that point in time where I feel like, okay, this can actually work, then I'm going to create those tests. And that's the point where I, for example, start using Fluent Assertions.
So when you write these tests, you're following test-driven development. How would you simmer that down in a pragmatic approach for someone who's not really familiar with that?
Yeah. So the traditional definition is red-green refactor. You create a test, you generate dummy implementations of the code that actually test is executing. Then you execute the test will be red. You'll fix the implementation, test will be green, and then you refactor. As I already alluded to, it doesn't work like that in reality. At least it doesn't work for me, and I've tried this in the past, and the books still try to say that you should do that away. Now, as I said, I start with the design, then I create a couple of tests. Usually, I don't even refactor. Usually, by creating a couple of tests, I get a second opinion about, does this API make sense? Am I testing at the right scope? And that's a really important topic. Then maybe, you know, I do a little bit of redesign, rewrite the test to make sense. And the interesting thing is, when I do that, when I start creating those tests and implementing the logic behind that, it almost becomes natural, because basically all these extra cases will pop up in your mind. All these edge cases will pop up in your mind. Like, what happens if I call this method first? What happens if this class wasn't initialized? What happens if this parameter is missing? And I basically write it down as small to-dos in my C# code, which I then use as almost like a cookie crumb, or what is it? They call these
cookie
things.
cutter.
Like a path, a reminder for myself, like, okay, I have to think of these scenarios. And usually I implement 3 or 4 tests before I start to refactor. Because I believe that refactoring, if you see the same thing twice, I like to think it's almost like coincidence. If I see something 3 times, it could be a pattern that needs to be refactored, but I'm also very careful, conservative with applying dry, don't repeat yourself. But usually, so 3, 4 scenarios, and if I then actually see a pattern that requires refactoring, I will refactor, and then the cycle starts over again. But in reality, I mean, it's not really a cycle. It's a really creative process. You just, I usually draw it as a circle with all these steps in it, but it's a much more elaborate thing than just red, green, refactor.
Yeah, interesting. So when you write these tests initially, you're kind of having to write small ideas as the test. Do you find that helps you write more maintainable code? Because you're testing, hopefully, small pieces of software instead of typing out a big function and maybe breaking it up later.
So yes and no. I've also tried unit testing without TDD, and I've actually experienced myself with large-scale teams that leads to code that's not really well testable. And the side effect of that is it is also less difficult to understand, or more difficult to understand how everything ties together. So by practicing test-driven development at the right scope, it actually leads to design that's much more focused. But the crucial element, and that's what a lot of books don't tell you, is that you need to understand the internal boundaries of a system. So a lot of books tell you like every class, every method, every module in React or whatever you're practicing should be its own scope, its own unit. I strongly disagree with that. Because if you do that, it leads to thousands of tests, and whenever you refactor something, you have to rewrite your tests. If you actually understand your internal boundaries, if you understand like this is a functional module, or this is a piece of code that consists of a couple of classes, which is designed to be reusable, that becomes almost your natural unit in unit testing. And that means you're testing bigger. So this whole TDD thing, which sounds like it's a testing technique, in reality is a design technique that leads to better decoupled, still with strong cohesion, code bases.
So when you have these TDD style code bases over time, do you find that it helps keep that development velocity somewhat consistent with bigger apps that maybe aren't following some of the best patterns? They might slow down over time as complexities are there. Does TDD help kind of slow down the slowdown?
So as I have been doing this job for 27 years, and I've been practicing test-driven development pretty consistently for the last 15 years, for me it's almost impossible to not do it. It's like, I don't know if people drive without seatbelts here, but for me it feels like driving without seatbelts. How can I change my code without having some tests that actually provide me confidence? Because I guess this is what it's all about. Like a developer wants to feel confident that if he or she changes the code base, it didn't break anything. This is what we do with Fluent Assertions as well. It has 97% coverage, which is huge. It's ridiculously high. It's just because some people actually went nuts with tools like mutation testing. I would say if you have 80 to 90% coverage, you should be in a pretty good state. But the fact is, I can change stuff, even Fluent Assertions, which you would expect. I know this code base, from the back of my pocket. I don't anymore. There's so many edge cases that we actually ran into over the years. I fully rely on the test suite to make sure I don't break anything.
So as Fluent Assertions kind of grew in popularity beyond just a pet project of yours, were there any surprises or big lessons you learned as kind of the community gained control and influence and ideas for the library?
Yes, plenty. I mean, this is my talk. What my talk at NDC was mostly about. It has become almost like a blueprint for the way I actually work with my clients. So I usually go into a client, help them professionalize the entire software development lifecycle. And there's so many aspects about, issue tracking, build pipelines, accepting requests, accepting issues, discussing issues, understanding the impact on the design that I've actually learned from using and building Fluent Assertions, which I now apply to my clients. And you run into things, some people get annoyed because they don't get the feature they want. They keep asking, like, when are you going to implement this? Like, dude, it's an open source project. I'm doing this next to my full day job, my family, my other hobbies, presenting at conferences across the country, across the world. Don't expect too much. And I know actually open source developers that actually got burned out because there was such a high expectation. The good thing is we get a lot of contributions, a lot of pull requests from contributors, even to a point that we had to say, like, okay, guys, stop all the refactoring stuff. We're working on the next major version. We only have limited time. All of that is exactly like you see it at internal projects. How to do semantic versioning, how to make sure you don't introduce breaking changes, how to document your code, how to create internal SDK kind of documentation so that other teams can benefit from that. It's really, it has been almost like a continuous stream of ideas and experiences for me.
Yeah, it's a very interesting cycle. Do you have any words of advice for people who might want to make an open source library or that is gaining adoption or popularity? Tips and advice or even words of caution?
That's a good question, actually. I would say be friendly, but also be honest. One of the cases for my talk is that we actually accepted support for data sets, which is something which not a lot of people use anymore. It's something from the early days of .NET. And we accepted it because the person that created the pull request spent an enormous amount of time on it. And we felt almost like guilty that we didn't, we were afraid to say no, because we've also learned that you have to be careful with the community. In retrospect, that was a mistake. We should have said no, like, okay, thank you. And we changed the process to protect us from that. But in general, be friendly, talk about just show people what the advantages are, but care about the quality. Treat your open source project as the best possible code you can write, including documentation, tests. All of that will increase trust that people have in your library. I'm not saying this is going to be the secret success, like Fluentd Search, because honestly, I don't know why it became so big. I'm still surprised. I still remember the day that somebody wrote a blog post about it. Like, why would you write the blog post about a simple Fluent API for assertions? But I guess these are the elements. Yeah. Make sure it's really good.
Yeah, for
that
sure.
you're proud of what you accomplished. Yeah, I think that's it.
What keeps you going in terms of developing it? Is it the passion for the project or the TDD style that it came out of, or the community, all of it?
I mean, I use it every day in the projects that I work with, and it just helps to make my test more readable. And the fact that it's giving me a lot of things back. I mean, it's not giving me money back. My wife once made fun of it, like if you would only get 1 cent for every download, so we have like 329 downloads. It's not like I'm counting, but I checked it yesterday. I have to update my presentation title every time I do it. Yeah, I don't know. People come to me and they thank me for an open source project. Like, okay, I just like to do it. It's passion. It is passion in a positive way. Not like David Whitney said, like passionate people that really scream at you. I like to build. I like to see this grow, and I like to hear that people use it, and I love seeing people being happy about it. I think that's a major driving force. Money was never the issue, or never the driving force. It was giving something back to the community and showing people what you can accomplish if you practice the principles in a pragmatic way.
Thanks, Dennis. That's been really valuable insight. This is Luke Parker signing off from SSW TV.